Rich society women humiliate Sandra Bullock at a charity gala. Without knowing that Tom Cruise was. The ballroom shimmered under the glow of crystal chandeliers, their golden light reflecting off the champagne flutes and diamond-studded gowns of the city's elite. It was the annual Everly Foundation Charity Gala, a night where wealth, power, and status were on full display. Waiters in crisp white jackets weaved through the crowd, balancing trays of foie gras and caviar. At the center of it all, a group of high society women stood in a glittering circle, their designer gowns worth more than most people's yearly salaries. Among them was Vivian Harrington, a socialite known for her razor-sharp tongue and an even sharper eye for status. "Honestly, I don't know why they let just anyone in these days," Vivian whispered behind the rim of her champagne glass, glancing toward a woman across the room. The target of her disdain? Sandra Bullock. Sandra, elegant yet modest in a sleek black gown, stood near the silent auction table, admiring a painting. She had been invited as a guest of honor, but to the women of high society, she was an outsider, talented, yes, but not one of them. A-list actress or not, she just doesn't have the pedigree, darling. Vivian smirked. A few of the women giggled, their eyes flickering toward Sandra with thinly veiled amusement. "She probably thinks money can buy class," another woman whispered. "Poor thing." Sandra, unaware of their snide remarks, remained focused on the artwork before her. She had always found these events exhausting, smiling, nodding, pretending to fit into a world where wealth was a sport and status was currency. And then there was him, Tom Cruise. Except tonight, no one recognized him. Dressed in a simple black suit, with his hair slightly tousled and no entourage in sight, Tom blended effortlessly into the background. No flashing cameras, no red carpet. Just a man in a room full of people who only cared about appearances. He leaned against the bar observing. He had seen enough in his life to recognize the moment before something ugly unfolded. The way Vivian and her clique glanced at Sandra. The way their laughter carried just a little too far. Tom had attended this gala for years, but tonight, he was here for a different reason. Tonight, he wasn't here as a Hollywood star. He was here as something else entirely. And soon, these women would learn exactly who they had just insulted. Sandra Bullock ran a gloved finger along the edge of the ornate frame, studying the painting in front of her. It was a breathtaking landscape, an oil painting of a quiet lake at dusk, the kind of piece that told a story all on its own. She loved art that made people feel something. But she wasn't just admiring the painting. She was stalling. The murmur of high society conversations hummed around her, a symphony of whispered judgments and polished fake smiles. She had been to dozens of these events, yet they never got any easier. No matter how many awards she won, how many millions she donated to charities, or how much she tried to blend in, there were always people like Vivian Harrington, women who saw her as nothing more than a guest in their world. Across the room, Vivian and her circle continued their quiet laughter, their gazes flicking toward Sandra, as if she were some amusing curiosity. They saw her as an actress playing dress-up in their elite circles, a woman who had earned her fortune through talent rather than inheritance. "She's probably here hoping to network," Charlotte Mayweather, another woman in Vivian's clique, smirked. "Maybe find a wealthy husband to elevate her status." Vivian laughed, swirling her champagne. "Well, bless her heart. I mean, really, how sweet of her to think she belongs here." A few feet away, Tom Cruise tightened his grip on his whiskey glass. He had seen this play out too many times before. People who mistook fame for belonging. People who thought that money alone could buy a seat at their exclusive table. But true power wasn't loud. It didn't need validation. And tonight, these women were about to learn that lesson. Tom had intentionally arrived alone, dressed down, unrecognized by most in the crowd. Without the flashing cameras, without the tailored tux and Hollywood fanfare, he was invisible. And he liked it that way, because when people didn't know who you were, they revealed who they truly were. A waiter passed by, offering another round of champagne. Tom shook his head, his gaze locked onto Vivian as she whispered something to Charlotte. Something that made Charlotte's eyes widen before she stifled a laugh behind her gloved hand. It was about Sandra. Tom exhaled slowly. This wasn't his battle to fight. Not yet. Instead, he pushed away from the bar and made his way across the ballroom. If there was one thing he knew about people like Vivian, it was that they loved an audience. And if they wanted to put on a show tonight, the sound of clinking glasses and muted conversation filled the ballroom, an elegant backdrop for the unfolding drama. Sandra Bullock exhaled softly, reminding herself why she had agreed to attend in the first place. It was for charity, not for these women, not for their judgmental glances or their veiled insults. But as she turned away from the painting, ready to find her seat, Vivian Harrington stepped directly into her path. "Sandra, darling." Vivian's lips curled into a smile, her tone saccharine. "I was just telling the girls how inspiring it is that you still come to these events. It must be exhausting pretending to fit in with people who actually belong here." Sandra's jaw tightened. She had dealt with arrogance before, but Vivian had perfected the art of dressing an insult in velvet. "I don't pretend, Vivian," Sandra said evenly. "I show up, I give, and I leave. Simple." Vivian let out a small laugh, shaking her head as if Sandra had just said something adorable. Of course. And you're always so generous." Vivian gestured toward the auction table. "Are you planning to bid tonight? Or are you just here to admire things that are out of reach?" Sandra's fingers curled slightly, but before she could respond, a deep voice cut through the air. "I don't know, Vivian," Tom Cruise said, stepping beside Sandra. "What's truly out of reach? The painting, or the class it takes to respect someone who's done more for charity than anyone in this room?" Vivian's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing as she turned to face Tom. He was deliberately unremarkable tonight. No security, no assistants, just a black suit and quiet confidence. And that made him dangerous, because people like Vivian didn't know how to recognize power, unless it was dressed in excess. "And who exactly are you?" Vivian asked, tilting her head, trying to assess whether this man was worth her attention. Tom smirked. He wasn't going to give her the answer she expected. "No one important," he said casually, slipping his hands into his pockets. "Just someone who knows the difference between wealth and worth." Sandra, sensing Vivian's growing frustration, hid a smirk. Vivian took a slow sip of champagne, masking the way her ego flared at the idea that someone, anyone, would dare challenge her in her domain. "Well," she said smoothly, "I suppose some people are content with being observers at events like these. Enjoy the view." She turned sharply on her heel, motioning for Charlotte and the other women to follow her. As they walked away, Sandra exhaled, finally allowing herself to acknowledge Tom fully. "That was unexpected," she admitted, turning to him with curiosity. Tom shrugged. They were being rude. Sandra studied him. There was something familiar about him, but she couldn't quite place it. His presence was steady, assured, like someone who had seen every version of people and still managed to keep his own center. "You didn't have to step in," she said, though she was grateful. "I know," Tom said simply. A small silence stretched between them before Sandra extended a hand. "Sandra." Tom took it. Tom. Just Tom. No last name. No grand introduction. And for now that was enough. But the night wasn't over yet. Vivian wasn't done playing her game. An unseen game begins seated at her table. Vivian twirled the stem of her wine glass between two fingers, her expression unreadable. Tom's interruption had irritated her. She wasn't used to being challenged. And something about him, something didn't sit right. "He's nobody," Charlotte muttered, rolling her eyes. "Probably one of those new money types who thinks that makes him interesting." Vivian, however, wasn't convinced. "He's too comfortable," she murmured. "A man like that, he's seen things. He knows things." Charlotte scoffed. "You're reading too much into it. Let's just focus on the auction. Oh, did you see that stunning diamond necklace up for bid?" But Vivian's mind was elsewhere. If this Tom thought he could embarrass her, he was sorely mistaken. By the end of the night, she'd make sure he regretted stepping into her world. Vivian's mind was already at work calculating. Tom and Sandra had embarrassed her, and she wasn't the type to let something like that go unpunished. She needed to remind everyone who she was, that this was her world, and people like Sandra Bullock and some random nobody didn't get to walk in and challenge her authority. And so, with a small, knowing smile, she leaned over and whispered to one of the event coordinators. Within minutes, an announcement rang out over the ballroom speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, As part of tonight's charity auction, we will be hosting an exclusive VIP seat raffle, an opportunity for one lucky guest to join the city's most esteemed philanthropists at next week's private diamond luncheon, hosted by none other than our gracious event sponsor, Mrs. Vivian Harrington. Applause rippled through the crowd, but Sandra stiffened. She knew exactly what Vivian was doing. The private diamond luncheon was infamous among the wealthy elite, a gathering where the wealthiest women flaunted their riches, casually belittling those who didn't meet their standards. The event was technically open to anyone, but in reality, it was a Shark Tank. Sandra wasn't stupid. Vivian was setting this up as a humiliation trap. She wanted Sandra, or worse Tom, to win, just so she could tear them down in front of everyone. Sandra turned to Tom, who was watching Vivian with the calm curiosity of a man watching someone dig their own grave. "She's baiting us," Sandra muttered under her breath. Tom smirked. "I know. And you're going to let her?" His smirk widened. "Oh, I absolutely am." Sandra blinked. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" Tom shrugged, sipping his drink. "I like watching people reveal themselves." Sandra couldn't argue with that. The raffle tickets were distributed, and within minutes, the announcer pulled a name from the gold-trimmed glass bowl. The room fell into perfect silence as the name was read aloud. And the winner of the exclusive VIP seat at next week's private diamond luncheon is Tom Cruise. A collective hush fell over the ballroom. Tom Cruise. Every head turned. Vivian's champagne glass froze in midair. Her lips parted but no sound came out. And just like that, the room began to shift. Whispers surged through the crowd like an electric current. "Wait. Tom Cruise. The Tom Cruise. No way, that's not, is it?" Sandra didn't even try to hide her smirk. She looked at Tom, who was effortlessly composed. He tilted his head slightly, watching Vivian with quiet amusement. Vivian, normally so poised, so in control, was visibly unraveling, because she had just tried to humiliate Tom Cruise. And in doing so, she had handed him the perfect opportunity to humiliate her instead. The ballroom had flipped. The same people who had been so quick to judge him earlier were now clamoring to be near him, murmuring about how they knew it all along, how they had sensed something different about him. Vivian had lost control of the night. But the worst part? Tom hadn't even done anything. He had just existed, and that was enough to turn the entire game against her. Vivian's last desperate move. Vivian's pulse pounded in her ears. She needed to regain control fast. Forcing a bright smile, she laughed lightly and clinked her glass. "Well, what a surprise," she said, her voice dripping with forced amusement. "Tom, darling, I had no idea. What a wonderful coincidence." Tom raised an eyebrow, but he didn't say a word. And that silence was excruciating for Vivian. She needed to spin this. "Now that we know who you really are," she continued, her voice as smooth as silk, "I'd be absolutely honored to have you at my luncheon." She was desperate. Tom knew it. Sandra knew it. Everyone knew it. And then, Tom did something that no one expected. He smiled. "Vivian," he said casually, taking a step closer. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." Vivian's smile twitched. She had no choice but to act like this was her idea all along. But deep down she knew. She had lost. And next week at the private diamond luncheon, Tom Cruise was going to make sure she knew it. The Harrington estate was a spectacle of wealth. The towering marble pillars gleamed in the midday sun. The vast garden was filled with the city's most influential and elite women, and the air carried the scent of freshly imported lilies and expensive champagne. This was Vivian's domain. It was here that she dictated the social order, deciding who belonged and who was merely a guest in her world. And today, in front of an audience handpicked to adore her, she would reclaim control. Or at least, that's what she thought. The setup for humiliation. Seated at the head of the longest table, Vivian wore a radiant smile, exuding power. To her right, the city's most prominent wives, heiresses, and socialites whispered and giggled behind their diamond-studded fingers. And directly across from her, Sandra Bullock and Tom Cruise. Sandra's expression was unreadable, but Tom? Tom looked amused, like a man watching a game he had already won. Vivian refused to be intimidated. With an effortless laugh, she raised her glass. "Ladies, I want to extend my deepest gratitude to each of you for being here today. And of course, She turned her gaze to Tom, her smile sharp. "To our very special guest, Mr. Tom Cruise." The room applauded lightly, but beneath the surface, Vivian's intentions were crystal clear. She wasn't welcoming Tom. She was about to humiliate him. She gestured toward a gold-trimmed invitation card beside each plate. "As you all know, our luncheon has a lovely tradition. Our guests of honor share a bit about themselves. Their backgrounds, their accomplishments, and of course," she let the pause linger, then added, "their charitable contributions." A few women tittered with thinly veiled anticipation. Vivian's strategy was transparent. She expected Tom to stumble. He wasn't supposed to belong here. So in her mind, if she forced him to speak about philanthropy, about wealth, about status, she could expose him as an outsider. And once the illusion shattered, she would take back control. Vivian turned to Tom with mocking warmth. "Tom, darling, since you're our most mysterious guest today, would you do us the honor?" Sandra subtly tensed. Vivian was playing dirty. She was setting up Tom to fail. And worse, she was doing it publicly. For the first time that afternoon, the room fell silent. Every eye was locked on Tom. And then, Tom leaned forward slightly relaxed, tapping his fingers lightly against the edge of the table. His gaze met Vivian's, steady and unreadable. And then he spoke. Tom's unfolding revelation. "Well," Tom began, his voice casual but commanding, "I don't usually talk much about my charitable contributions." Vivian's lips curled slightly. "Of course you don't. But," he continued, "since you insist," he turned his gaze to the rest of the table. "I recently helped fund a medical program that provides free surgeries for underprivileged children. Around $30 million worth of procedures last year alone." A quiet murmur swept through the women. Vivian's smile twitched. But Tom wasn't finished. "I've also backed several education programs, giving scholarships to students from low-income families. We've built about 15 schools in the past 3 years." The murmurs grew louder. And Vivian? For the first time in her life, she looked unprepared. Tom lifted his glass, his tone still effortlessly casual. "And let's not forget the relief fund for disaster-stricken communities. Last year, we provided over 10,000 homes to families displaced by natural disasters." The silence was deafening. Even the wealthiest women in the room, many of whom had publicly boasted about their charity work, were stunned. Sandra hid her smirk behind her champagne glass. "Vivian?" She was losing them. And Tom wasn't even done. "I've always believed that real wealth isn't about how much you own. It's about what you do with it." He met Vivian's gaze with a polite, unreadable smile. "Wouldn't you agree, Mrs. Harrington?" Checkmate. Vivian's throat bobbed as she forced out a breathless laugh. "Oh, of course," she stammered. "Such noble efforts. Really just remarkable." Tom smiled slightly. Vivian knew what had just happened. She had tried to humiliate him. And instead, she had exposed herself. The realization sets in the entire power dynamic in the room had shifted. The women who had once hung on to Vivian's every word were now whispering to each other, eyes darting toward Tom with newfound admiration. Even the staff, who had silently endured Vivian's arrogance for years, exchanged glances. Vivian had built her reputation on being the most influential woman in the room. But now, she wasn't anymore. And she knew it. Her jaw clenched ever so slightly, but she had to keep smiling. Because if she didn't, the entire room would see what she had just realized. That she had lost. The final blow. Sandra, finally speaking, set her glass down with a soft clink. "Well, this has been delightful," she said, her voice dripping with amusement. She stood up. And without another glance at Vivian, she turned to Tom. "Ready to go?" Tom smiled, standing as well. Vivian, speechless, could only watch as the two most talked about people at her event simply walked away. And with them, they took her power. Because after today, no one would look at Vivian the same way again. And she knew it. Vivian's hands trembled as she gripped the stem of her champagne glass, the sparkling liquid inside rippling with her barely contained frustration. Her carefully orchestrated humiliation had backfired spectacularly. Tom and Sandra had walked away, unbothered, untouchable, while the rest of the room now whispered, casting glances at her, not with admiration, but with quiet amusement. She had spent years cultivating an image of power, of influence, of being the woman no one dared to challenge. And now, in the span of a single luncheon, Tom had dismantled it all, without even raising his voice. The realization settled in like a slow-moving poison. The silent revolution one by one. The women at the table began to stir. Some were still whispering. Others, those who had once fawned over her, suddenly seemed indifferent. Vivian's closest allies, women who had always been at her beck and call, were now conveniently occupied with their own conversations, their laughter a little too forced, their glances deliberately avoiding hers. She turned to her left, seeking solace in her most trusted companion Eleanor. But Eleanor, ever the opportunist, was already aligning herself with the new order. With a practiced smile she stood raising her glass. "Well, ladies," she announced, her voice smooth as silk. "I must say, Tom Cruise's generosity is truly inspirational." She turned to the rest of the table. "I think we should take a page from his book. After all, isn't that what true philanthropy is about?" A soft chorus of agreement followed. Vivian felt something inside her snap. This was her luncheon, her kingdom, her domain. And yet, no one was looking at her anymore. The final blow. Vivian forced a laugh. "Well, of course," she said through clenched teeth. "True philanthropy, yes. That's exactly what we—" Before she could finish, a server approached discreetly and leaned in to whisper something in her ear. Her stomach dropped. The check. She had spent a small fortune curating this event. The imported decor, the high-end catering, the exclusive wines. Everything was custom selected to reinforce her image of power. And now, with her reputation hanging by a thread, she would have to foot the bill alone. She forced another tight-lipped smile and reached for her clutch, pretending not to notice the way Eleanor and the others had already excused themselves from the table. Vivian Harrington, the woman who had spent years commanding the attention of the city's elite, was now sitting alone at her own event. And for the first time in her life, she had never felt smaller. The silence of the nearly empty banquet hall was deafening. Vivian sat frozen, her once perfectly poised demeanor crumbling under the weight of what had just transpired. Her reign was over. The waitstaff had begun clearing plates, whispering among themselves as they moved past her. No one approached her. No one offered comfort or reassurance. She was alone. For years, Vivian Harrington had wielded power through perception, knowing that status wasn't just about wealth. It was about how people believed you carried it. But now, that illusion had shattered. The very people who had once clamored for her attention had slipped away into the background, aligning themselves with someone truly untouchable, Tom Cruise. She clenched her jaw, watching the last of them leave. Eleanor hadn't even said goodbye. Her fingers trembled as she pulled out her black Amex card and placed it on the tray the server had discreetly set in front of her. The bill had always been hers to handle, but this time, it felt different. It felt like an exile, a different kind of power. Meanwhile, just outside the lavish event, Tom and Sandra strolled toward the valet. Sandra let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head in disbelief. "Well," she said, "that was dramatic." Tom grinned, hands in his pockets. "I told you it'd be fun." Sandra turned to him, arching an eyebrow. "You enjoyed that?" Tom shrugged. "I don't like people who think kindness is weakness." He exhaled, looking up at the night sky. "I think she got the message." Sandra studied him for a moment before smiling. "You didn't just humble her. You changed the whole dynamic of that room. Those women, they're going to rethink everything about who they align with now." Tom chuckled. "Maybe, but that wasn't the point." Sandra tilted her head. "Then what was?" He met her gaze, his expression serious now. "Some people need to be reminded that the real power isn't in status or money. It's in how you treat people." Sandra nodded slowly. "And what happens to people like Vivian once they realize that?" Tom smirked. "They either change, or they fade into irrelevance." A lesson learned. Or not 2 weeks later, Vivian sat in the private lounge of an upscale club, sipping her martini in silence. She had spent the past few days watching the tides shift in the social circles she once commanded. Her calls went unanswered. Her invitations, politely declined. Eleanor had positioned herself as the new queen, aligning with the very people Vivian had dismissed. The irony was almost comical. She took another sip of her drink, her eyes scanning the room. Maybe Tom was right. Maybe power wasn't about status alone. Maybe, just maybe, she had been playing the wrong game all along. But would she change? The question lingered in the air as she leaned back, watching the new social order unfold without her. Vivian sat in the dimly lit lounge, her perfectly manicured fingers tracing the rim of her martini glass. For the first time in years, she wasn't the center of attention. The whispers, the subtle nods of respect, they were gone. Her entire social empire had shifted overnight, and she had been left behind. For the past 2 weeks, she had tried everything to salvage her position. She hosted exclusive luncheons, sent extravagant gifts, and even attempted to spin the narrative, painting herself as the misunderstood victim of an unfortunate misunderstanding. But no one cared. Eleanor had taken her throne. And Tom Cruise? He had never even acknowledged her existence again. She exhaled, staring into her drink. Had she been wrong all along? Had she spent her life chasing a kind of power that didn't even matter? A different kind of victory across the city, in a quiet cafe far removed from the glittering ballrooms of high society. Sandra Bullock laughed over a simple cup of coffee. Tom sat across from her, wearing his usual easygoing grin. You really don't miss that world, do you? Sandra asked, stirring a bit of cream into her coffee. Tom shook his head. Not for a second. Sandra leaned back, studying him. You had them all fooled, you know. They thought you were just another nobody. Tom smirked. That was the fun part. Sandra laughed, shaking her head. And Vivian, what do you think happens to people like her? Tom's expression turned thoughtful. Some people learn. Others don't. He took a sip of his coffee, then added. But either way, they stop mattering. Sandra nodded slowly. Vivian had spent her life chasing admiration, control, and influence, only to watch it crumble the moment someone with real presence walked into the room. In the end, status had never been the real power. It was character. The legacy we leave back at the lounge. Vivian finished her drink and set the glass down with a quiet clink. For the first time in her life, she wasn't sure what came next. Would she learn from this? Would she rebuild, this time with a different purpose? Or would she cling to the past, fading into irrelevance as Tom had predicted? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain. Her world would never be the same again. Final takeaway: power isn't about status. It's about how you treat people when you think you don't need them.